The Golden Age of Piracy, a comprehensive timeline, 1650 to 1730, Volume 1. Introduction: The conditions that created an age of pirates. Welcome to this detailed exploration of the Golden Age of Piracy, a period spanning approximately 80 years from the mid-17th century to the early 18th century. As we begin this journey through time, allow yourself to settle comfortably as we methodically trace the political, economic, and social conditions that gave rise to one of history's most romanticized yet brutal eras of maritime lawlessness. The Golden Age of Piracy did not emerge suddenly or without cause. Rather, it developed gradually from a complex interplay of factors, including European colonial expansion, the growth of Atlantic trade routes, frequent warfare between European powers, and the availability of experienced sailors willing to turn to piracy when legitimate employment became scarce. Understanding these underlying conditions provides essential context for the events that would unfold over the following decades. The Caribbean Sea and the surrounding Atlantic waters became the primary theater for pirate activity during this period, though piracy also flourished in the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, and along the coast of West Africa. The Caribbean's importance stemmed from its position at the center of European colonial trade networks. Spanish treasure fleets carried silver and gold from Mexico and Peru through Caribbean waters on their way to Spain. English, French, and Dutch colonies in the Caribbean and North America produced valuable commodities including sugar, tobacco, indigo, and cotton that were shipped to Europe. This concentration of valuable shipping created rich opportunities for those willing to prey upon commerce. The political situation in the Caribbean during the mid-17th century was characterized by constant competition and periodic warfare between European powers. Spain claimed vast territories in the Americas based on papal decrees from the late 15th century, but England, France, and the Netherlands refused to recognize these claims and established their own colonies. The contested nature of Caribbean waters meant that legitimate naval forces were often engaged in combat with each other, creating a fluid situation where the line between sanctioned military action and piracy could become blurred. The Buccaneers, 1650 to 1680. The term buccaneer derives from the French word boucan, referring to a wooden frame used for smoking meat. The original buccaneers were hunters who lived on the island of Hispaniola, smoking wild cattle and pig meat to sell to passing ships. These hunters were predominantly French, English, and Dutch settlers who had established themselves on the northern and western coasts of Hispaniola, away from Spanish settlements concentrated in the south and east of the island. In the 1640s and 1650s, Spanish colonial authorities attempted to drive these settlers from Hispaniola by destroying their settlements and hunting grounds. Rather than submit to Spanish authority, many of these displaced hunters turned to the sea, using small boats to attack Spanish shipping. They retained the name buccaneers, though their activities had shifted from hunting cattle to hunting Spanish ships. The buccaneers established a base on the island of Tortuga, located just off the northern coast of Hispaniola. Tortuga's natural harbor and defensible position made it an ideal pirate haven. By the 1650s, Tortuga had become a thriving community of pirates, with a population that fluctuated between several hundred and over 1,000 men, depending on how many ships were at sea versus in port. The island had no formal government initially, operating under an informal system where strong leaders emerged through reputation and force of personality rather than legal authority. The French gradually established control over Tortuga during the 1660s, appointing governors and attempting to regulate buccaneer activities. However, French authority remained weak, and the buccaneers largely continued to operate independently. The French colonial administration maintained an ambiguous relationship with the buccaneers, sometimes commissioning them to attack Spanish targets, and other times attempting to suppress their activities, depending on whether France was at war or peace with Spain. In 1655, England captured Jamaica from Spain, establishing a major English presence in the heart of the Caribbean. The English governors of Jamaica quickly recognized the strategic value of the buccaneers as an irregular naval force that could harass Spanish shipping and colonies. The governors began issuing letters of marque and commissions to buccaneer captains, authorizing them to attack Spanish targets in exchange for sharing plunder with colonial authorities and agreeing to use Jamaican ports. Port Royal, located on a natural harbor on Jamaica's southern coast, became the primary English buccaneer base. The town grew rapidly during the 1660s and 1670s, its prosperity built on the plunder brought in by buccaneer expeditions. Port Royal developed a reputation as one of the wickedest cities in the world, a place where successful buccaneers could spend their earnings on alcohol, gambling, and other vices before returning to sea for another voyage. The buccaneer expeditions of this period varied greatly in size and ambition. Small raids might involve a single ship with a crew of 50 to 100 men attacking coastal settlements or merchant vessels. Larger expeditions could bring together multiple ships and several hundred men to attack fortified towns or even cities. The organization of these expeditions followed patterns that would later characterize pirate operations during the Golden Age proper. Buccaneer ships operated under articles agreed upon before each voyage. These articles specified how plunder would be divided, what compensation would be paid for injuries sustained in action, and what rules governed behavior aboard ship. The articles typically provided for democratic election of officers, with the captain chosen by vote of the crew and subject to removal if the crew lost confidence in his leadership. This democratic organization contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchy of naval and merchant vessels, where officers held absolute authority. The division of plunder followed formulas that allocated shares based on rank and role. A typical division might allocate 5 or 6 shares to the captain, 3 or 4 shares to the quartermaster and other officers, 2 shares to skilled crewmen like carpenters and surgeons, and 1 share to ordinary crewmen. Additional shares might be awarded to men who distinguished themselves in combat or who suffered injuries. The articles usually specified that the ship's owner, if there was one distinct from the crew, would receive a portion of the total before individual shares were calculated. Compensation for injuries was specified in detail, with different amounts for different types of wounds. Loss of a right arm might be compensated with 600 pieces of 8, loss of a left arm 500, loss of a right leg 500, loss of a left leg 400, loss of an eye 100, and loss of a finger 100. These compensation schedules reflected both the severity of different injuries and their impact on a man's ability to continue working. The right arm and leg were valued more highly than the left because most men were right-handed and would be more impaired by injuries to their dominant side. One of the most famous buccaneer expeditions occurred in 1668 when Henry Morgan, a Welsh buccaneer who had risen to prominence through successful raids, led an expedition against the city of Portobello on the Isthmus of Panama. Portobello was a major Spanish colonial port where silver from Peru was collected before being shipped to Spain. The city was heavily fortified with multiple castles and a substantial garrison. Morgan assembled a fleet of 12 ships carrying approximately 460 men. The expedition sailed from Port Royal in June 1668 and arrived off Portobello on July 10th. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the city's fortifications, Morgan landed his forces away from the city and approached overland under cover of darkness. The buccaneers captured one of the outlying forts through surprise assault, then used the captured position to attack the city's other defenses. The assault on Portobello involved brutal fighting, with the buccaneers taking heavy casualties, but eventually overwhelming the Spanish defenders through superior numbers and desperation. The Spanish governor refused to surrender even after the outer defenses fell, forcing Morgan to threaten to execute prisoners and burn the city. The governor finally capitulated after 2 weeks of fighting, agreeing to a ransom of 100,000 pieces of 8 for the city's release. The success of the Portobello raid made Morgan famous throughout the Caribbean and in Europe. The substantial plunder taken from the city, estimated at between 250,000 and 400,000 pieces of 8, including the ransom, was divided among the expedition members according to their articles. After deducting compensation for wounded men and shares for killed men's families, each ordinary crewman received approximately 100 pieces of 8. A substantial sum equivalent to several years' wages for a merchant sailor. Morgan's most ambitious expedition came in 1670, when he led a massive force against Panama City, the primary Spanish port on the Pacific coast of Central America. This expedition involved assembling 37 ships and approximately 2,000 men, making it one of the largest buccaneer operations ever undertaken. The logistical challenges of coordinating such a large force and maintaining cohesion among so many independently minded men were immense. The route to Panama City required crossing the Isthmus of Panama, as the buccaneer ships could not reach the Pacific side of the isthmus without sailing around South America, a voyage of months. Morgan's force sailed up the Chagres River as far as boats could navigate, then proceeded overland through jungle and mountain terrain. The march was grueling, with men suffering from heat, humidity, inadequate food supplies, and harassment by Spanish forces. After 9 days of marching, Morgan's force reached Panama City in January 1671. The Spanish had assembled a defending force of approximately 2,000 men, roughly equal to Morgan's numbers, but the Spanish forces were primarily militia rather than professional soldiers and were poorly coordinated. In the ensuing battle on the plains outside the city, Morgan's experienced fighters routed the defenders despite being exhausted from the march and low on ammunition. The buccaneers occupied Panama City and spent the following weeks searching for plunder. However, the amount of treasure found was disappointing. Much of the city's wealth had been evacuated before Morgan's arrival, and a fire that broke out during the battle destroyed much of the city. The total plunder was estimated at only 400,000 pieces of eight, which when divided among 2,000 men provided each ordinary crewman with less than 200 pieces of eight, barely compensating for the hardships of the expedition. The Panama raid had significant political consequences. England and Spain were not officially at war when the raid occurred, and the Spanish government protested vigorously to England about Morgan's attack on a major Spanish city. The English government, seeking to improve relations with Spain, arrested Morgan and brought him back to England to face charges. However, Morgan was not punished. Instead, he was knighted by King Charles II and appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, a remarkable transformation from pirate to colonial official. Morgan's appointment as Lieutenant Governor signaled a shift in English policy towards the buccaneers. By the early 1670s, England was seeking to establish more regular trade relations with Spain and to develop Jamaica's plantation economy. The buccaneers, while useful during wartime, had become an embarrassment and a diplomatic liability. Morgan himself, now a colonial official, was tasked with suppressing the very activities he had previously led. The transition from buccaneer to planter or colonial official was common among successful buccaneer leaders during this period. Men who had accumulated wealth through raiding invested in plantations, purchased land, and attempted to establish themselves as respectable members of colonial society. This transition was not always successful, as many former buccaneers lacked the capital or inclination for the patient accumulation of wealth through agriculture and trade. During the 1670s and 1680s, buccaneer activity gradually declined in the Caribbean as England, France, and even Spain moved toward more stable colonial relationships. However, some buccaneers continued operating, either with unofficial support from colonial governors who ignored official policy, or by relocating to areas beyond effective government control. The traditions established during the buccaneer era, including democratic ship organization and detailed articles governing conduct and plunder division, would be carried forward into the Golden Age of Piracy proper. The shift to the Indian Ocean, 1690s. As opportunities for sanctioned raiding diminished in the Caribbean, some pirates began looking to other regions offering rich targets and less effective law enforcement. The Indian Ocean became increasingly attractive during the 1690s as European trade with India and the Far East expanded, and as political conditions in the region created opportunities for piracy. The Indian Ocean trade was immensely valuable, with ships carrying silks, spices, gems, and other luxury goods from Asia to Europe, and carrying gold, silver, and manufactured goods from Europe to Asia. The distances involved were vast, with voyages from Europe to India taking 6 months or more each way. Ships traveling these routes were often heavily laden and vulnerable to attack, especially in the relatively poorly policed waters around Madagascar, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian coast. The Mughal Empire, which controlled most of the Indian subcontinent, maintained limited naval forces and was unable to effectively protect merchant shipping. European trading companies, including the English East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, maintained their own armed vessels, but these were concentrated around their major trading posts and could not patrol the entire region. This combination of valuable targets and limited enforcement created conditions conducive to piracy. Madagascar became a major pirate base during the 1690s, offering many of the same advantages that Tortuga and Port Royal had provided in the Caribbean. The island had numerous natural harbors suitable for careening ships and making repairs. The local population could provide food and supplies. The island's location off the East African coast positioned it near major shipping lanes while being remote from centers of European power. Several harbors along Madagascar's coast became known pirate havens, with St. Mary's Island on the northeast coast particularly favored. One of the earliest and most successful pirates to operate in the Indian Ocean was Henry Every, also known as Henry Avery, or by various other spellings. Every's career in the Indian Ocean was brief, lasting only about 2 years from 1694 to 1696, but it included one of the most profitable pirate captures in history and helped establish the Indian Ocean as a lucrative pirating ground. Every began his piratical career by leading a mutiny aboard the privateer Charles II in May 1694. The ship was anchored at La Coruña in Spain as part of a privateering expedition that had been delayed for months, with the crew's wages in arrears. Every and several other crew members seized control of the ship while the captain was ashore, locked up those who refused to join the mutiny, and sailed away with approximately 85 men willing to turn pirate. Every sailed the Charles II, renamed Fancy, to the Indian Ocean via West Africa and around the Cape of Good Hope. Along the way, the pirates captured several small vessels and recruited additional crew members from prize crews and from ships they encountered. By the time Every reached the Indian Ocean, the Fancy carried approximately 150 men and mounted 46 guns, making it a formidable vessel capable of challenging all but the largest armed merchantmen. In August 1695, Every encountered a small fleet of Mughal ships in the Red Sea, returning from a pilgrimage to Mecca. The fleet included the Ganj-e-Sawai, one of the largest and most richly laden ships in the Indian Ocean. The Ganj-e-Sawai was enormous for its time, displacing approximately 1,600 tons and carrying 62 guns. It also carried an estimated 400 to 500 people, including crew, passengers, and armed guards. Every, in company with several other pirate vessels that had joined forces with him, attacked the Mughal fleet. The smaller vessels in the fleet were quickly captured or scattered. The Gunj-e-Sawai proved more difficult, as its large gun armament and numerous crew made it a dangerous opponent. The battle lasted several hours, but eventually luck turned in the pirates' favor when one of the Gunj-e-Sawai's guns exploded during firing, killing several gunners and causing chaos on deck. The pirates boarded the Gunj-e-Sawai and overwhelmed its defenders after fierce hand-to-hand combat. Once in control of the ship, the pirates spent several days searching it and torturing passengers and crew to reveal hidden valuables. The accounts of what occurred vary, with some sources reporting that the pirates committed numerous atrocities, including murder and rape, while other accounts suggest the violence was limited to what was common in such captures. The value of the plunder taken from the Gunj-e-Sawai was extraordinary. Estimates vary widely, but most sources suggest the total value was between £200,000 and £600,000 sterling, an enormous sum equivalent to many millions of pounds in modern currency. When divided among approximately 150 pirates, each man's share was several £1,000s, enough to live comfortably for life if invested wisely. The capture of the Gunj-e-Sawai had significant political ramifications. The ship belonged to the Mughal emperor, and its capture and the mistreatment of its passengers, which included members of the emperor's family, enraged Mughal authorities. The emperor threatened to close English East India Company trading posts in India and to expel all English merchants unless the perpetrators were captured and punished. This threat endangered English trade, worth far more than the value of the captured ship. The English government responded by declaring Every and his crew to be pirates and offering substantial rewards for their capture. The East India Company added its own rewards and pressured colonial governors throughout the Atlantic and Indian Ocean regions to apprehend any of Every's crew. This marked the beginning of a more aggressive approach to piracy suppression, driven by the recognition that piracy in the Indian Ocean could threaten valuable trading relationships. Every, aware of the dangers he now faced, did not remain in the Indian Ocean to enjoy his wealth. Instead, he sailed the Fancy back toward the Atlantic, arriving in the Caribbean in early 1696. The crew divided the plunder and dispersed, with men going their separate ways to try to enjoy their wealth. Every himself disappeared, and despite rewards and investigations, he was never captured. His ultimate fate remains unknown, though various accounts suggest he may have retired to Britain under an assumed name, or may have been cheated of his wealth by merchants in Ireland. Several of Every's crew members were less fortunate. Some were recognized and arrested in various ports. In 1696, 6 men identified as members of Every's crew were brought to trial in London on charges of piracy. The trial attracted enormous public attention, with the defendants' crimes described in sensational detail. 5 of the 6 were convicted and executed by hanging at Execution Dock on the Thames River, their bodies displayed in cages as a warning to other sailors contemplating piracy. The Every case established important legal precedents regarding piracy jurisdiction and the punishment of pirates who operated in distant waters but were captured in British territory. It also demonstrated the British government's willingness to execute pirates even when their crimes had been committed against non-British vessels and subjects, reflecting the priority placed on maintaining trading relationships in the Indian Ocean. The War of Spanish Succession and its aftermath, 1701 to 1714. The War of Spanish Succession, which began in 1701 and continued until 1714, had profound effects on maritime employment and piracy. The war pitted France and Spain against a coalition including England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and various smaller powers. The conflict arose from disputes over who would succeed to the Spanish throne following the death of the childless Spanish king Charles II. During the war, all major maritime powers issued numerous letters of marque authorizing privateers to attack enemy shipping. Privateering provided governments with a way to harass enemy commerce without the expense of maintaining large naval forces. For sailors, privateering offered the prospect of legitimate profit through capturing enemy prizes while avoiding the stigma and legal dangers of piracy. The expansion of privateering during the war years provided employment for thousands of sailors. Port cities in England, France, and the American colonies outfitted hundreds of privateering vessels. The crews of these vessels gained experience in armed maritime operations, learning how to chase down merchant ships, to fight boarding actions, and to navigate in distant waters. They also grew accustomed to the excitement and potential profits of capturing prizes. When the War of Spanish Succession ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1714, privateering commissions were revoked and thousands of sailors found themselves unemployed. The transition from war to peace typically reduced the size of naval forces as governments sought to reduce expenses, eliminating many positions for professional sailors. The merchant marine could not absorb all the displaced sailors, leading to an oversupply of experienced maritime workers competing for limited positions. These conditions created a large pool of men with maritime and combat skills who were struggling to find legitimate employment. For some, turning to piracy seemed a reasonable alternative to unemployment or poorly paid merchant service. The skills learned during privateering transferred directly to piracy, with the main difference being the absence of government authorization. Many pirates of the post-Utrecht period had previously served on privateers during the war. The year 1714 thus marks a significant dividing line in the history of Caribbean piracy. Before this date, most maritime raiding in the region was conducted under some form of official authorization, whether as privateering during wartime or as nominally sanctioned actions against Spanish targets by English and French colonial governors. After 1714, with European powers generally at peace and attempting to suppress rather than encourage attacks on shipping, maritime raiding continued, but was now clearly piracy without official sanction. The transition from privateer to pirate was sometimes gradual and ambiguous. Some privateers who had operated under valid commissions during the war continued their activities after peace was declared, either unaware that their commissions were no longer valid or hoping to claim that they had not learned of the peace. Colonial governors sometimes continued issuing or tolerating commissions for attacks on Spanish shipping despite official peace, maintaining the earlier pattern of using irregular forces to harass Spain. The British government, however, was increasingly serious about suppressing piracy. The expansion of British colonial trade meant that British merchants now had more to lose from maritime lawlessness than to gain from sanctioning attacks on other nations' shipping. The Royal Navy began to receive orders to actively pursue pirates rather than simply protecting British shipping. Colonial governors received instructions to suppress piracy and to prosecute captured pirates vigorously. In 1717, King George I issued a proclamation offering a pardon to all pirates who surrendered within a specified time period. This proclamation, which came to be known as the King's Pardon or the Act of Grace, promised that pirates who gave themselves up to authorities before September 5, 1718, would receive full pardons for all piratical acts committed before January 5, 1718. The proclamation aimed to encourage pirates to abandon their careers while offering them a chance to return to legitimate society without facing prosecution. The King's Pardon represented a carrot-and-stick approach to piracy suppression. The pardon offered an escape route for pirates willing to reform, while simultaneously the British government strengthened enforcement efforts against those who refused to surrender. Naval patrols were increased in pirate-infested waters. Colonial governors received orders to deny pirates access to ports, and captured pirates faced swift trials and execution. The response to the King's Pardon varied among the pirate community. Some pirates, particularly those who had accumulated enough plunder to retire comfortably or who were weary of the dangers and hardships of piracy, accepted the pardon and surrendered. Others, either skeptical of government promises or too committed to piracy to consider alternatives, ignored the proclamation and continued their activities. Still others accepted the pardon, but later returned to piracy when legitimate opportunities proved disappointing or when the lure of easy plunder proved too strong. Nassau in the Bahamas became the primary location where pirates surrendered under the King's Pardon. Nassau had emerged during the previous decade as a major pirate haven, essentially operating as a pirate republic with minimal government authority. The town's natural harbor provided excellent anchorage and careening facilities, while its location near major shipping lanes made it convenient for pirate operations. By 1717, hundreds of pirates used Nassau as a base, with the town's economy entirely dependent on pirate spending. Woodes Rogers, a former privateer and circumnavigator who had captured a Spanish treasure galleon during the War of Spanish Succession, was appointed governor of the Bahamas in 1718 with explicit orders to suppress piracy. Rogers arrived in Nassau in July 1718, accompanied by Royal Navy warships and carrying copies of the King's Pardon. He offered the pardon to any pirates who would surrender, while making clear that those who refused would be hunted down and prosecuted. Several hundred pirates accepted Rogers' offer and received pardons. However, not all pirates in Nassau were willing to surrender. Some left the islands before Rogers arrived. while others initially accepted pardons but soon returned to piracy. Rogers faced the challenging task of transforming Nassau from a pirate haven into a legitimate colonial settlement, while dealing with a population that included both reformed pirates trying to go straight and unreformed pirates who remained in the area hoping to continue their activities covertly. The period from 1714 to 1718 thus represents a transition phase between the end of officially sanctioned privateering and the beginning of the final, most intense period of piracy in the Caribbean and Atlantic. The conditions were set for what would become the most famous era of piracy, when captains like Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and others would achieve notoriety through their exploits before being killed or captured as authorities intensified suppression efforts. Conclusion of Volume 1. This first volume has traced the origins and early development of the Golden Age of Piracy, from the buccaneers of the mid-17th century through the transition period following the War of Spanish Succession. We have examined how political conditions, economic opportunities, and individual choices combined to create an environment where piracy could flourish. The patterns established during this period, including democratic ship governance, detailed articles specifying rights and responsibilities, and the rotation between raiding and spending time in port towns would continue to characterize piracy during its final flowering in the 1720s. The stage is now set for the events of 1718 through 1726, when piracy reached its peak of intensity and when the most famous pirate captains would make their marks on history. The strengthening of anti-piracy measures, the closing of pirate havens, and the increasing effectiveness of naval patrols would gradually squeeze pirates out of their traditional operating areas, leading to increasingly desperate and violent actions as the pirates faced the prospect of capture and execution. These events will be explored in detail in Volume 2. The Golden Age of Piracy, a comprehensive timeline, 1650 to 1730, Volume 2. The Peak Years, 1718 to 1726. The years from 1718 to 1726 represent the culmination and final phase of the Golden Age of Piracy. During this period, piracy reached its greatest intensity, with dozens of active pirate ships operating in Caribbean, Atlantic, and West African waters. Simultaneously, government suppression efforts intensified, leading to the capture or death of most major pirate captains by 1726. This volume will examine this final flowering of piracy in careful detail, tracing the careers of individual pirates and the gradual success of anti-piracy campaigns. Edward Teach, Blackbeard, the most infamous pirate. No pirate of the Golden Age achieved greater fame or infamy than Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard. While his actual piratical career lasted only about 2 years, from late 1716 or early 1717 until his death in November 1718, Blackbeard became the archetypal pirate in popular imagination, his reputation enhanced by his fearsome appearance and his dramatic final battle. Edward Teach's origins are uncertain, as is common for pirates of this era whose lives before turning to piracy were often poorly documented. Most sources suggest he was born in Bristol, England, around 1680, making him approximately 37 or 38 years old when he died. Some accounts place his birthplace as London or Jamaica, but Bristol appears most frequently in contemporary records. His youth and early career remain almost entirely unknown, though he likely went to sea at a young age, possibly as a merchant sailor or privateer during Queen Anne's War. Teach appears in historical records in 1716 when he served aboard a Jamaican privateer commanded by Captain Benjamin Hornigold. Hornigold was one of the most prominent pirates operating out of Nassau in the Bahamas during this period. The crew sailed under privateering commissions issued by the government of Jamaica, though the legitimacy of these commissions was questionable as England was not officially at war. The line between privateering and piracy was particularly blurred during this transitional period. Under Hornigold's command, Teach learned the techniques of piracy and gained experience in naval combat and ship handling. Hornigold recognized Teach's abilities and in 1717 gave him command of a sloop the crew had captured, allowing Teach to operate semi-independently while remaining part of Hornigold's loose confederation. This was a common pattern among pirate groups, with successful captains spinning off subordinates to command captured vessels while maintaining informal alliances. In November 1717, Teach's crew captured a large French merchant vessel, La Concorde, off the island of St. Vincent. La Concorde was a 300-ton slave ship carrying a cargo of enslaved Africans from West Africa to the Caribbean. The capture of such a large, well-built vessel represented a major prize for Teach, providing him with a ship suitable for conversion into a powerful pirate vessel. Teach put the French crew and the enslaved captives aboard smaller vessels and claimed La Concorde for himself. He extensively modified the ship, adding extra cannon until it mounted approximately 40 guns, making it one of the most heavily armed pirate vessels in the Caribbean. He renamed the ship Queen Anne's Revenge, possibly as a sardonic reference to the recent end of Queen Anne's War, or as a claim to be carrying out Queen Anne's vendetta against England's enemies, even though the Queen had died in 1714. The Queen Anne's Revenge became Blackbeard's flagship and the most formidable vessel under his command. With this ship, Teach had the firepower to challenge all but the largest naval vessels and could intimidate merchant ships into surrendering without resistance. The psychological impact of seeing a heavily armed ship bearing down was often sufficient to make merchant crews give up without a fight, knowing that resistance against such superior force would likely be futile and bloody. Teach cultivated a fearsome appearance to enhance this psychological warfare. He was tall and powerfully built, with a long black beard that he allegedly braided and tied with ribbons. Contemporary accounts describe him tucking slow-burning fuses under his hat during battle, creating a wreath of smoke around his head that made him appear demonic. Whether this detail is true or embellished by later storytellers is unclear, but it became a defining element of Blackbeard's legend. In the spring of 1718, Blackbeard operated along the Atlantic coast of the American colonies, capturing numerous merchant vessels from the Carolinas to Delaware. His squadron, which by this time included the Queen Anne's Revenge and 3 or 4 smaller vessels with a total crew of approximately 300 to 400 men, was the most powerful pirate force operating in North American waters. In May 1718, Blackbeard blockaded the port of Charleston, South Carolina, for approximately 1 week. The blockade involved stopping all ships attempting to enter or leave Charleston Harbor and plundering their cargoes. One of the captured vessels carried several prominent Charleston citizens, whom Blackbeard held for ransom. His demands were unusual. Rather than requesting money, he demanded a chest of medicines. The specific reason for this demand is unclear, though some sources suggest Blackbeard's crew was suffering from syphilis or other diseases and needed treatment. The Charleston authorities, facing a powerful pirate force and concerned for their captured citizens, complied with Blackbeard's demands and provided the medical supplies. Blackbeard released the hostages unharmed and sailed away from Charleston. This incident demonstrated both Blackbeard's power, sufficient to blockade a major colonial port, and his pragmatism in making demands that authorities could meet without excessive cost. Shortly after leaving Charleston, Blackbeard sailed to North Carolina, where he entered into negotiations with the colonial governor, Charles Eden. In June 1718, Blackbeard and approximately 20 of his crew accepted the king's pardon from Governor Eden in the town of Bath, North Carolina's colonial capital. The pardon ostensibly ended Blackbeard's piratical career, allowing him to retire peacefully with his accumulated plunder. However, Blackbeard's retirement was either brief or nominal. Within months of accepting the pardon, he was again capturing vessels, though on a smaller scale than before. Whether he viewed his pardon as genuine and later returned to piracy, or whether he never intended to truly retire and accepted the pardon simply to gain a safe haven, remains unclear. Governor Eden's role is also ambiguous, with some sources suggesting the governor knowingly sheltered Blackbeard in exchange for a share of plunder. The situation with Blackbeard concerned Governor Alexander Spotswood of neighboring Virginia, who viewed Blackbeard as a threat to commerce and was frustrated by North Carolina's apparent tolerance of the pirate. In November 1718, Spotswood commissioned a naval expedition to capture or kill Blackbeard, even though doing so required entering North Carolina waters without that colony's authorization, potentially creating an intercolonial incident. Spotswood hired 2 small sloops, placing them under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy. Maynard's force consisted of approximately 60 sailors and soldiers divided between the 2 vessels. The sloops were chosen because their shallow draft would allow them to navigate the inlets and sounds of the North Carolina coast, where Blackbeard was reported to be anchored. Maynard's expedition located Blackbeard's ship, the Adventure, a smaller vessel than the Queen Anne's Revenge, which Blackbeard had run aground and abandoned earlier that year, anchored near Ocracoke Island on November 21, 1718. Blackbeard's crew at this time numbered only about 25 men, much reduced from his force earlier in the year. Whether Blackbeard had deliberately reduced his crew size to live more quietly, or whether men had left for various reasons, is unknown. The battle that ensued on November 22nd, 1718, became one of the most famous pirate engagements in history. Maynard's two sloops approached Blackbeard's position at dawn. Blackbeard, recognizing the vessels as naval ships rather than merchants, prepared for battle. The initial engagement involved an exchange of cannon fire and small arms as the vessels maneuvered in the shallow waters. Maynard's sloops both ran aground on sandbars during the approach, leaving them vulnerable to Blackbeard's fire. Blackbeard took advantage, raking the grounded vessels with cannon and small arms fire, killing and wounding several of Maynard's men. However, Maynard managed to free his vessel from the sandbar and close with Blackbeard's ship for boarding. As the vessels came alongside each other, Blackbeard and most of his crew boarded Maynard's sloop. Maynard had ordered most of his men to hide below decks, creating the impression that Blackbeard's initial fire had been more effective than it actually was. When the pirates boarded, they found themselves facing a larger force than expected as Maynard's hidden men emerged from below. The fighting was fierce and close quarter, with pistols, cutlasses, and boarding axes used at point-blank range. Blackbeard personally engaged Maynard in combat, and the two men exchanged pistol and sword blows. According to Maynard's later account, he and Blackbeard were fighting with swords when one of Maynard's men came up behind Blackbeard and struck him in the neck with a cutlass. The blow severely wounded, but did not immediately kill Blackbeard, who continued fighting despite his injuries. Blackbeard sustained multiple wounds during the melee. Maynard's official report, written shortly after the battle, stated that Blackbeard's body showed 5 pistol ball wounds and approximately 20 cutlass wounds when examined after death. The precise sequence of wounds and which one actually killed him is unclear, but the sheer number testifies to both the ferocity of the combat and Blackbeard's determination to fight to the end. With Blackbeard dead, his surviving crew members, outnumbered and demoralized, surrendered. Maynard ordered Blackbeard's head severed and hung from the bowsprit of his sloop as a trophy and as proof of the pirate's death. The body was thrown overboard, reportedly swimming around the ship several times before sinking, according to legend, though this detail is almost certainly apocryphal. The surviving members of Blackbeard's crew, 13 men, were transported to Virginia for trial. All were convicted of piracy, and all but 2 were hanged in Williamsburg in March 1719. The 2 who escaped execution had served as forced men, sailors compelled to join Blackbeard's crew against their will and who could prove they had taken no active part in piracies. Blackbeard's death effectively ended major pirate activity along the North American coast. His reputation had been such that his removal significantly reduced the pirate threat in those waters. However, piracy continued elsewhere, particularly in the Caribbean and off West Africa, where other notable captains were building their own reputations. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, the most successful pirate. If Blackbeard was the most famous pirate of the Golden Age, Bartholomew Roberts was arguably the most successful, measured by the number of ships captured. Roberts' piratical career lasted from June 1719 until February 1722, during which time he and his crews captured more than 400 vessels, far exceeding the totals of any other pirate captain. Bartholomew Roberts was born John Roberts in 1782 in Pembrokeshire, Wales. He went to sea at a young age and spent most of his adult life as a merchant sailor, serving on various trading vessels in legitimate employment. At age 37, an age when most sailors were well established in their careers, Roberts made the unlikely transition from law-abiding merchant sailor to pirate captain. In June 1719, Roberts was serving as third mate aboard the slave ship Princess, which was captured off the coast of Ghana by pirates commanded by Howell Davis. Davis, a Welshman like Roberts, was one of the more successful pirate captains operating off West Africa at the time. The capture of the Princess was routine, but what happened next was unusual. Davis recognized Roberts' navigational and leadership abilities and invited him to join the pirate crew. Roberts later claimed he was forced to join Davis's crew, a claim that might have been true initially, but that became questionable given his subsequent actions. Whether forced or willing, Roberts quickly adapted to pirate life and demonstrated such capability that when Davis was killed in an ambush just 6 weeks after Roberts joined the crew, the pirates elected Roberts as their new captain. The election of Roberts as captain demonstrates the democratic nature of pirate ship governance. Roberts had been a pirate for only 6 weeks and had no previous experience as a pirate captain. Yet the crew chose him over other candidates who had been pirates longer. His selection suggests he possessed qualities the crew valued, likely including navigational skill, decisiveness, and leadership ability that had already become evident during his brief time with the crew. Roberts proved to be an exceptionally effective pirate captain. Within days of assuming command, he led his crew in capturing a Portuguese treasure ship carrying approximately 40,000 gold moidores along with sugar and hides. This single capture, worth thousands of pounds, immediately established Roberts's reputation and likely helped secure the crew's loyalty to their newly elected captain. Over the following months, Roberts ranged widely across the Atlantic, from Brazil to Newfoundland to West Africa, capturing vessels almost continuously. His tactics combined careful planning with aggressive action. He would study shipping patterns to position his ships where merchant traffic was heavy, would carefully observe potential targets before attacking to assess their defensive capabilities, and would pursue captured vessels relentlessly once committed to an attack. Roberts developed a code of conduct for his ships, a detailed set of articles that governed crew behavior and specified how plunder would be divided, what compensation would be paid for injuries, and what punishments would be imposed for violations of the rules. These articles, which have survived in contemporary accounts, provide detailed insight into pirate ship governance and the values pirates held. Roberts' articles specified that every man had an equal vote in affairs of the moment and equal title to fresh provisions and strong liquors seized from captured ships. The articles prohibited gambling for money aboard ship, required lights and candles to be extinguished by 8 in the evening, and mandated that each man keep his weapons clean and ready for action. Musicians were allowed to rest on Sundays, but on other days could be called to perform at any time without right of refusal. Compensation for injuries was detailed precisely. Loss of a right arm would be compensated with 600 pieces of 8 or 6 able slaves. Loss of a left arm earned 500 pieces of 8 or 5 slaves. Loss of a right leg earned 500 pieces of 8. Loss of a left leg 400. Loss of an eye 100. And loss of a finger 100. These schedules reflect both the severity of injuries and their impact on a man's ability to continue working. The articles prohibited women and boys from being brought aboard ship on pain of death. This rule was not universal among pirates, as some crews included women, but Roberts apparently believed that sexual competition over women would create discord that could destroy crew cohesion. The prohibition of boys likely reflected similar concerns about sexual conduct. Desertion in battle or keeping secrets from the company resulted in punishment of marooning, where the offender would be put ashore on an uninhabited island with only a bottle of water, a pistol, and ammunition. Striking another crew member while aboard ship resulted in punishment of Moses's law, meaning 40 lashes on the bare back. These punishments were severe, but were considered necessary to maintain discipline. Roberts himself was unusual among pirates in several respects. Contemporary accounts describe him as abstemious, preferring tea to alcohol and maintaining a more refined appearance than most pirates. He dressed in fine clothes captured from prizes, often wearing a rich damask waistcoat and breeches, a red feather in his hat, and a gold chain with a diamond cross. This attention to appearance may have been partly theatrical, creating an image of a gentleman pirate that distinguished him from common sailors. Despite his refined tastes, Roberts was ruthless in combat and in punishing those who opposed him. When colonists in Barbados and Martinique sent vessels to hunt him, Roberts swore revenge. He created a personal flag showing himself standing on 2 skulls labeled ABH and AMH, representing a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head, advertising his particular enmity toward those islands. Roberts demonstrated this ruthlessness when he captured ships from Barbados or Martinique. While he generally treated crews from other nations relatively well, releasing them with their personal possessions after taking cargo, he showed no mercy to Barbadians or Martinicans. Crew members from those islands might be tortured, killed, or otherwise abused as Roberts enacted his revenge for their colony's opposition to his activities. In June 1720, Roberts captured a fleet of 42 Portuguese ships in Trepassey Harbour in Newfoundland. The merchant vessels had gathered in the harbour waiting for a naval escort to accompany them back to Portugal. Roberts' arrival created panic, with some captains deliberately running their ships aground to prevent capture. Roberts methodically plundered the fleet, taking what cargo he wanted and burning several ships. The incident demonstrated both Roberts' audacity in attacking such a large fleet and the ineffectiveness of merchant defenses when no naval protection was present. Roberts' success eventually drew the attention of Royal Navy anti-piracy patrols. In February 1722, HMS Swallow, a Royal Navy warship commanded by Captain Challoner Ogle, engaged Roberts' squadron off the coast of West Africa. Roberts at this time commanded 2 ships, the Royal Fortune and the Great Ranger, with combined crews totaling approximately 300 men. The battle began when the Swallow encountered the Great Ranger. After a brief engagement, the great Ranger surrendered. The Swallow then sailed to find Roberts in the Royal Fortune. The engagement occurred on February 10th, 1722, when the Swallow approached the Royal Fortune at dawn. Roberts, who had been up all night drinking with crew members, came on deck when the lookout reported a sail. Seeing what he believed to be a merchant vessel, Roberts decided to attack. As the Royal Fortune approached, the crew realized the stranger was a naval warship, but by then it was too late to escape. The Swallow opened fire at close range, and one of the first shots struck Roberts in the throat, killing him almost instantly. Roberts' crew, following his standing orders that he should be buried at sea rather than having his body fall into enemy hands, immediately threw his body overboard before the Swallow could board. The crew fought on for another 2 hours before surrendering. The loss of their captain, combined with being heavily outgunned by a purpose-built warship, had doomed the defense from the start. The captured crew members, numbering approximately 160 men, were transported to Cape Coast Castle in present-day Ghana for trial. The trial was one of the largest piracy trials ever conducted, with most of the crew convicted of piracy. 52 men were hanged in groups over several weeks in March and April 1722. Many others received prison sentences or were sentenced to indentured servitude. A few were acquitted, mostly men who could prove they had been forced to join Roberts' crew and had not participated willingly in piracies. Roberts' death and the destruction of his squadron represented a major victory in anti-piracy efforts. His removal eliminated the most prolific pirate captain operating in the Atlantic and demonstrated that even the most successful pirates could be caught and destroyed by determined naval action. The decline of piracy, 1722 to 1726. The years following Roberts' death saw a rapid decline in pirate activity as anti-piracy measures became increasingly effective. The combination of naval patrols, colonial cooperation in denying pirates access to ports, and the execution of captured pirates created an environment where piracy became increasingly difficult and dangerous. Several factors contributed to the decline. First, the closing of pirate havens eliminated safe bases where pirates could rest, resupply, and spend their plunder. Nassau had been brought under government control by Woodes Rogers. Madagascar, the major Indian Ocean pirate base, became less hospitable as European naval patrols increased and as local populations became less willing to trade with pirates. Without safe harbors, pirates were forced to remain at sea longer, increasing the risks of disease, malnutrition, and encounter with naval forces. Second, colonial governments became more cooperative in anti-piracy efforts. Whereas earlier governors had sometimes tolerated or even encouraged piracy, by the early 1720s, most governors recognized that piracy threatened the trade that their colonies depended upon. Governors shared information about pirate sightings and movements, coordinated patrol efforts, and consistently prosecuted captured pirates. This cooperation made it harder for pirates to exploit gaps between different colonial jurisdictions. Third, merchant ships improved their defenses and became more willing to resist pirate attacks. Merchant captains learned that surrendering to pirates did not guarantee safety, and that resistance, while dangerous, might succeed if the merchant vessel was well armed and the crew determined. Some merchant ships began sailing in convoys protected by naval escorts, making them much harder targets than isolated vessels. Fourth, the economic incentives for piracy diminished. As naval patrols increased and markets for stolen goods became more restricted, the profitability of piracy declined. Pirates found it harder to sell their plunder, as merchants who had previously purchased stolen goods became wary of prosecution as receivers of pirate property. Without ready markets, captured cargoes lost much of their value. Fifth, the effectiveness of naval anti-piracy patrols improved. The Royal Navy and other European navies learned from experience how to hunt pirates effectively. They identified the waters where pirates operated most frequently, established patrol patterns that increased the likelihood of encounters, and developed tactics for engaging pirate vessels. The accumulation of intelligence about pirate movements and the sharing of this information between naval commanders allowed more focused pursuit. Charles Vane, Defiance and Downfall. Charles Vane represents a particular type of pirate, one who consistently refused opportunities for reform and whose defiance of authority ultimately led to his downfall. Vane was active as a pirate from approximately 1716 until his capture in 1719, operating primarily in Caribbean waters. Vane first appears in historical records as part of Henry Jennings' crew, operating out of Jamaica around 1716. Jennings was a privateer-turned-pirate who had salvaged treasure from Spanish wrecks off the Florida coast and had then turned to outright piracy. Vane learned his trade in this environment, where the line between legitimate salvage, privateering, and piracy was deliberately blurred. By 1717, Vane had his own command and was operating out of Nassau. He was one of the more prominent pirate captains based there, commanding a brigantine with a crew of approximately 75 men. Vane's approach to piracy was characterized by aggression and violence. Contemporary accounts describe him as being particularly cruel to captives, torturing prisoners to reveal hidden valuables, and sometimes killing captives even after they had surrendered. When Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in July 1718 with the king's pardon, most pirates in the harbour accepted the pardon and surrendered. Vane was the notable exception. As Rogers' squadron approached Nassau, Vane loaded a captured French ship with combustible materials and set it alight, sending it toward Rogers' vessels as a fireship. The fireship caused no significant damage, but the gesture demonstrated Vane's contempt for the pardon and his intention to continue pirating. Vane escaped from Nassau before Rogers could move against him, sailing away with approximately 90 men who chose to follow him rather than accept the pardon. Over the following months, Vane operated in the Caribbean, capturing merchant vessels and accumulating a reputation as one of the more dangerous pirates at large. In September 1718, Vane encountered a French warship off the coast of South Carolina. The warship was substantially larger and more heavily armed than Vane's brigantine. Vane, recognizing that attacking such a formidable opponent would be extremely risky, decided to flee rather than fight. This decision was prudent from a tactical standpoint, but it violated pirate customs that expected captains to show courage and aggression. Vane's quartermaster, John Rackham, who would later achieve his own notoriety as Calico Jack, challenged Vane's decision. According to pirate articles, major decisions including whether to attack a particular target required crew vote. Rackham argued that the crew should vote on whether to attack the French warship. When the vote was held, the majority supported Rackham's position that they should attack. However, another article in most pirate codes gave the captain absolute authority during chase and battle. Vane invoked this authority and refused to attack despite the crew's vote. This created a situation where Vane had technically acted within the articles, but had lost the confidence of his crew. The following day, the crew voted to depose Vane as captain and elected Rackham to replace him. Vane and approximately 15 men who remained loyal to him were given a small sloop and allowed to leave. This resolution was relatively generous by pirate standards, where deposed captains might simply be marooned. Vane's supporters were few enough that he could not command a significant vessel, but he continued pirating in a small way, attacking minor targets in the Caribbean. In February 1719, Vane's sloop was wrecked in a hurricane off the coast of Honduras. Vane and a few survivors managed to reach an uninhabited island where they survived for several weeks on fish and whatever they could forage. Eventually, a ship arrived at the island to take on water. By an extraordinary coincidence, the ship's captain was a former privateer who had known Vane during his earlier career. The captain recognized Vane and, knowing his reputation, refused to take him aboard, fearing that Vane might incite a mutiny or seize the ship. The captain left Vane on the island, though he later mentioned Vane's presence there to another ship captain. This second captain, who had not known Vane personally, went to the island and rescued the castaways, not realizing one of them was a notorious pirate. Vane's identity remained unknown until the ship reached Jamaica, where Vane was recognized by another former privateer who was now serving aboard a Royal Navy vessel. Vane was arrested and imprisoned in Port Royal to await trial. He was tried in March 1720 and convicted of piracy based on the testimony of former crew members and victims. He was hanged at Gallows Point in Port Royal on March 29, 1720. Vane's execution was public and well attended, as pirate executions typically were. The bodies of executed pirates were often displayed in cages or on gibbets near harbors as warnings to other sailors contemplating piracy. Vane's body was reportedly hung in chains at a prominent location in Kingston Harbor, where it remained for years as it slowly decomposed, serving as a grim reminder of the penalty for piracy. John Rackham, Calico Jack, a lesser pirate with famous associates. John Rackham, known as Calico. Jack, for his preference for calico clothing, was a relatively minor pirate whose fame rests largely on his association with two female pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Rackham's career as a pirate captain lasted less than 2 years, from September 1718, when he was elected to replace Charles Vane, until his capture in October 1720. After deposing Vane, Rackham commanded the brigantine for several months. operating in Caribbean waters and capturing small merchant vessels. His success was modest compared to captains like Roberts or even Vane. The ships he captured were primarily small traders and fishing vessels carrying relatively minor cargoes. Rackham seems to have lacked either the ambition or the ability to tackle larger, more valuable targets. In May 1719, Rackham and his crew sailed into Nassau and accepted the king's pardon from Woodes Rogers. Rackham's acceptance of the pardon appears to have been genuine initially. He settled in Nassau and for approximately 8 months attempted to live as a law-abiding resident. During this period, he became romantically involved with Anne Bonny, a young woman who had come to Nassau with her husband, a small-time sailor. Anne Bonny was born in Ireland around 17, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer and a servant. Her father had emigrated to Charleston, South Carolina, where he had established a successful legal practice and plantation. Anne grew up in relative prosperity, but developed a reputation for a violent temper. According to one probably apocryphal account, she killed a servant girl with a knife during an argument. Anne married a sailor named James Bonny and moved with him to Nassau. The marriage was apparently unhappy, and Anne soon began an affair with John Rackham. When her husband discovered the affair, he brought a complaint to Governor Rogers, who ordered Anne to return to her husband. Anne refused, and she and Rackham decided to return to piracy together. In August 1720, Rackham and approximately a dozen men, including Anne Bonny, dressed in men's clothing, stole a sloop from Nassau Harbor and sailed away. This return to piracy violated Rackham's pardon and made him liable to prosecution and execution if captured. The addition of Anne Bonny to the crew was unusual, as most pirate articles prohibited women aboard ship, but Rackham apparently convinced his crew to make an exception. Over the following months, Rackham's crew captured several small vessels in waters around Jamaica. The crew remained small, never exceeding about 25 men, and the prizes were minor. However, during this period, the crew was joined by another woman, Mary Read, who had been captured from a merchant vessel and had revealed her sex only after joining the pirate crew. Mary Read's background was as unusual as Anne Bonny's. Born in England around 1685, Mary had been dressed and raised as a boy by her mother, who was attempting to deceive the child's grandmother into providing financial support by pretending the child was the legitimate grandson of the grandmother's deceased son. Mary continued dressing as a man into adulthood, serving in the British military in Flanders during the War of Spanish Succession. After the war, Mary had married a Flemish soldier, and the couple had opened a tavern. When her husband died shortly thereafter, Mary resumed male dress and returned to military service, eventually traveling to the Caribbean. She was aboard a merchant vessel when it was captured by Rackham's crew. Recognizing the opportunity piracy offered, she joined the crew, apparently revealing her sex to Rackham and Bonny, but continuing to dress as a man and to be treated as a male crew member by the rest of the crew. The presence of 2 women on Rackham's ship, while unusual, apparently caused no significant problems. Both Bonny and Read were accepted as full members of the crew and participated in combat alongside the men. Contemporary accounts from crew members captured with them testified that both women were as fierce and capable as any male pirate, fighting with pistols and cutlasses during attacks and showing no reluctance to engage in violence. In October 1720, Rackham's sloop was surprised by a Jamaican sloop commanded by Jonathan Barnett, who was operating under a commission from the governor of Jamaica to hunt pirates. Barnett encountered Rackham's vessel anchored off the western coast of Jamaica. According to later testimony, most of Rackham's crew were drunk when Barnett attacked, having captured a rum shipment earlier that day and celebrated their success. The battle was brief. Barnett's sloop approached Rackham's vessel and called for surrender. When Rackham refused, Barnett opened fire. Most of Rackham's crew, drunk and taken by surprise, quickly retreated below deck. Only Anne Bonny and Mary Read, along with one or two men, remained on deck fighting. The two women reportedly cursed their crewmates for cowardice and fired down into the hold, trying to force the men back on deck to fight. Despite their efforts, the defense was hopeless. Barnett's crew boarded the pirate vessel and captured everyone aboard. Rackham and his crew were taken to Jamaica for trial. The trial occurred in November 1720 at St. Jago de la Vega, now Spanish Town. All crew members were convicted of piracy. Rackham and the male crew members were sentenced to hang. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, however, both claimed to be pregnant. English law prohibited executing pregnant women, a protection based on the principle that an unborn child should not be punished for its mother's crimes. The court accepted their claims and postponed their executions until after they gave birth. Rackham was executed on November 18, 1720. Anne Bonny was allowed to visit him in prison before his execution. According to legend, her parting words to him were dismissive. "I am sorry to see you here, but if you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." Whether these words were actually spoken or are later embellishment is unknown, but they became part of the legend surrounding Bonny. Mary Read died in prison in April 1721, apparently from fever contracted in the unhealthy conditions of the jail. She never gave birth, and whether she was actually pregnant or had lied to delay execution is unclear. Anne Bonny's fate is unknown. She disappears from historical records after her conviction. She was not executed, as no record of her execution exists, and her pregnancy was confirmed. Some sources suggest she was released, possibly through her father's influence, and returned to Charleston, where she married and lived quietly. Other sources suggest she died in prison, like Read, though no death record exists. Edward Lowe, the sadistic pirate. Edward Lowe represents the darker extreme of piracy, a captain whose cruelty exceeded even the brutal norms of the era. Lowe was active as a pirate from May 1721 until his disappearance in 1724. His career, while relatively brief, was marked by exceptional violence and torture of captives that shocked even other pirates. Lowe was born in Westminster, London, around 1690. He grew up in poverty and from a young age was involved in crime, reportedly working as a pickpocket and burglar. He went to sea in his teens and eventually arrived in Boston, where he worked in the rigging lofts and married a young woman from the area. His wife died in childbirth around 1719. leaving Low with a daughter he could not care for. In 1721, Low was working aboard a sloop transporting logs from the Bay of Honduras to Boston. According to later accounts, Low had an argument with the ship's captain over payment for work. When the captain struck Low with a musket, Low responded by taking up an axe and attempting to split the captain's head. The captain dodged, and the blow killed another crew member instead. Low and several men who supported him seized the ship's boat and rowed away, effectively turning pirate. Low and his small band soon captured a small vessel off the coast of Rhode Island. Over the following weeks, Low captured several more vessels and recruited more crew members. By the end of 1721, Low commanded a ship with approximately 40 men and was operating in Caribbean waters. Low's reputation for cruelty developed quickly. Unlike many pirates who treated captives relatively well once they surrendered, Low seemed to take pleasure in torture and mutilation. Numerous accounts from surviving captives describe Low cutting off ears, noses, and lips of prisoners, burning men with slow matches, and devising elaborate tortures. One particularly horrific incident occurred when Low captured a Portuguese ship. The Portuguese captain had thrown a bag containing approximately 11,000 gold coins overboard to prevent the pirates from taking it. When Low discovered this, he became enraged. He ordered the Portuguese captain's lips cut off, cooked them, and forced another Portuguese captive to eat them while they were still hot. He then killed the captain and murdered the entire Portuguese crew. On another occasion, Low captured a ship whose captain had hidden some valuables. When Low discovered the deception, he had the captain hoisted up and down by a rope several times, then cut off his ears. Still unsatisfied, Low had the captain shot. This pattern of excessive violence toward captives who resisted or attempted to hide valuables became Low's trademark. Low's cruelty extended even to his own crew. He maintained discipline through terror, reportedly killing crew members for minor offenses. According to one account, he shot his quartermaster through the head while the man slept because Low suspected the quartermaster of plotting against him. This murder of a senior crew member without trial violated pirate customs and demonstrated Low's paranoia and willingness to kill anyone he perceived as a threat. Despite his cruelty, or perhaps because of it, Low commanded successfully for nearly 3 years. His squadron at its peak included 3 or 4 vessels with combined crews totaling over 100 men. The crews tolerated Low's violence either because they shared his sadistic tendencies, feared him too much to oppose him, or were drawn by the success his aggressive tactics achieved in capturing prizes. Low operated primarily in the Caribbean and along the North American coast, ranging from the Carolinas to Newfoundland. He captured dozens of vessels, with estimates suggesting he took between 80 and 100 prizes during his career. Most were small merchants and fishing vessels, though he occasionally captured larger ships. In June 1722, Low was operating off the Azores when his squadron encountered a large Portuguese ship. The Portuguese vessel was well armed and fought back vigorously. During the battle, Low was shot in the jaw, shattering the bone and causing severe injury. A French surgeon who was a prisoner aboard Low's ship performed primitive surgery. removing shattered bone and attempting to repair the wound. Lowe survived, but was left permanently disfigured. This injury, rather than moderating Lowe's behavior, seems to have made him even more violent. Post-injury accounts describe Lowe as being even more quick to torture and kill captives, possibly taking out his pain and rage on prisoners who could not defend themselves. Lowe's end is uncertain, as he disappeared from historical records in 1724. Several conflicting accounts exist of his fate. One story suggests he was marooned by his own crew after the quartermaster and other officers had grown tired of his violence and erratic behavior. The crew allegedly voted to depose Lowe and left him on a small island with minimal supplies. Another account claims Lowe made it to Brazil, where he was captured by Portuguese authorities. According to this version, the Portuguese recognized Lowe as the pirate who had murdered Portuguese nationals and executed him. A third account suggests Lowe eventually sailed to Africa, where he died of fever or was killed by natives. No definitive evidence exists for any of these versions, and Lowe's ultimate fate remains unknown. What is certain is that Lowe's piratical career ended by 1724, and that he did not retire peacefully with his plunder. Whether he was killed, marooned, or died of disease, Lowe did not achieve the comfortable retirement that some successful pirates managed. His excessive cruelty had made him enemies even among pirates, and his fate likely reflected the hatred he had generated through years of senseless violence. The final suppression, 1724 to 1726. By 1724, pirate activity had declined substantially from its peak just a few years earlier. The execution or death of major pirate captains, including Blackbeard, Roberts, Rackham, and others, had removed the most successful and charismatic leaders. Naval patrols had become more effective at intercepting pirates. Colonial ports had closed to pirate visits. The combination of these factors made piracy increasingly difficult and unrewarding. The few pirates still operating by 1724 were generally less successful and more desperate than their predecessors. They commanded smaller vessels with smaller crews and captured fewer and less valuable prizes. Many were former crew members of deceased captains who had elected new leaders but lacked the organizational ability or luck of the earlier generation. One of the last significant pirate captains was John Phillips, who operated from 1723 until his death in April 1724. Phillips had served under Thomas Anstice, himself a former lieutenant to Bartholomew Roberts. When Anstice accepted a pardon in 1723, Phillips and some crew members who refused the pardon elected Phillips as their captain and continued pirating. Phillips operated primarily off Newfoundland and the New England coast, capturing fishing vessels and small merchants. His success was limited, and contemporary accounts suggest his crew was frequently short of supplies and lived in harsh conditions. In April 1724, some of Phillips's crew members, including the ship's carpenter John Rose Archer and several forced men who had been compelled to join the pirates, organized a mutiny. The mutineers attacked Phillips and other loyal crew members, killing Phillips and several others in hand-to-hand fighting aboard ship. The mutineers then sailed to Boston and surrendered to authorities, turning over the surviving pirates and explaining their role in ending Phillips's career. The forced men who had led the mutiny were released as heroes for destroying a pirate crew, while the surviving pirates who had served Phillips willingly were tried and executed. Another late-period pirate was John Gow, who operated in European waters during 1724 and 1725. Gow had been a mate aboard a merchant vessel trading in the Mediterranean. In November 1724, Gow led a mutiny, killed the captain and several officers, and turned the ship to piracy. Gow operated in the North Sea and around the British Isles, an unusual area for pirates during this period. He captured several merchant vessels but achieved limited success. In February 1725, while attempting to raid settlements in the Orkney Islands north of Scotland, Gow's ship ran aground. The crew was captured by local residents and turned over to authorities. Gow was transported to London for trial. He was convicted of both piracy and murder and was hanged at Execution Dock in June 1725. His execution was noted for the gruesome detail that the rope broke during the first hanging attempt, and Gow had to be hanged a second time. His body was afterward hung in chains at a prominent location on the Thames as a warning to other sailors. By 1726, organized piracy in the Atlantic and Caribbean had effectively ended. A few individual pirates or very small crews continued operating in remote areas, but they were isolated criminals rather than organized groups. The Golden Age that had seen hundreds of pirates operating dozens of ships across multiple oceans had concluded. The end of the Golden Age resulted from multiple reinforcing factors. The naval suppression efforts had killed or captured most experienced pirate leaders. The closing of pirate havens had eliminated safe bases. The improvement in merchant ship defenses had made piracy more dangerous. The reduction in markets for stolen goods had made piracy less profitable. Together, these factors created an environment where piracy was no longer a viable career choice for sailors seeking alternatives to merchant service or naval duty. The legacy of the Golden Age extended far beyond its actual duration. The pirates of this era, particularly figures like Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts, entered popular culture and became legendary figures. Their actual lives, brutal and often short, were romanticized in literature and later in films, with the violence and squalor of pirate life downplayed while the adventure and freedom were emphasized. The democratic governance practices of pirate ships influenced political thought, particularly regarding consent of the governed and social contracts. Some historians have suggested that pirate ship articles represented early experiments in democratic governance that influenced later political developments, though this connection remains debated. The legal precedents established through piracy trials, particularly regarding jurisdiction and the definition of piracy as a crime subject to universal jurisdiction, influenced the development of international law. The principle that pirates were enemies of all mankind and could be tried by any nation that captured them became an accepted part of maritime law. Conclusion: the end of an era. The Golden Age of Piracy, spanning approximately 80 years from the mid-1650s to the mid-1720s, represented a unique period in maritime history. Political conditions, economic opportunities, and social factors aligned to create an environment where piracy could flourish on an unprecedented scale. Thousands of men chose to turn pirate, seeking freedom, fortune, or simply survival in an era when legitimate opportunities were limited and harsh. The pirates themselves were diverse in background and motivation. Some were experienced sailors seeking better conditions than those offered by merchant or naval service. Others were former privateers who continued their wartime activities into peacetime. Still others were criminals or adventurers drawn by the promise of easy plunder. Whatever their origins, they created a subculture with distinctive customs, governance practices, and values that set them apart from legitimate maritime society. The suppression of piracy demonstrated that no matter how successful or numerous pirates became, they could not ultimately prevail against organized state power. When European governments decided that piracy threatened their economic interests more than it served their political goals, they committed resources to anti-piracy campaigns that systematically destroyed pirate organizations. The pirates' lack of permanent bases, inability to match naval firepower, and dependence on markets controlled by their enemies made their defeat inevitable once states seriously committed to suppression. The romantic image of pirates that persists in popular culture bears little resemblance to the historical reality. Real pirates lived brutal, dangerous lives characterized by violence, disease, poor nutrition, and the constant threat of death in battle by execution or from disease. Few pirates retired wealthy. Most died young, either in combat, by execution, or from the diseases that ravaged crews forced to live in crowded, unsanitary conditions aboard ship for extended periods. Yet the pirates of the Golden Age achieved something that resonated beyond their time. They created functioning democratic communities aboard their ships at a time when democracy was rare in any context. They challenged established authority and carved out spaces where they could live by their own rules. They demonstrated that ordinary sailors could organize themselves effectively and could challenge the maritime powers of their age, even if only temporarily. These achievements, rather than their criminal activities, may explain why pirates continue to fascinate long after the Golden Age ended.